The autumn rain in northern Illinois fell in cold, relentless sheets, a steady drumming against the roof of the base housing unit that usually lulled Commander Jack Callahan into a deep, dreamless sleep. But tonight, the sound felt like a warning. Jack was a man who seemed carved from the very bedrock of duty and discipline, standing a solid 6'2" with broad shoulders that bore the weight of decades of service to his country. His face was weathered, etched with lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun of foreign deserts and the salt spray of open oceans, and a faint, jagged scar ran along his jawline, a silent testament to a mission that had gone sideways years ago. At 45, he was a seasoned Navy SEAL, a man of few words but immense action. Yet tonight, in the quiet of his room, he was simply a son far from home. At the foot of his bed lay Kodiak, a magnificent German shepherd whose size and stature commanded respect even in repose. Kodiak was a prime example of his breed, with a thick, lustrous coat of black and tan that absorbed the shadows of the room, and a noble, blocky head that rested on his paws. His ears, large and triangular, swiveled forward, twitching at a sound Jack had not yet registered. Kodiak's dark brown eyes, pools of ancient intelligence and fierce loyalty, snapped open a split second before the phone on the nightstand buzzed, sliding across the wood with a jarring vibration. Jack's hand shot out, silencing the device before the first ring could fully echo. The caller ID displayed St. Michael's Medical Center, and the air in the room seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping as dread coiled tightly in Jack's stomach. He answered with a voice that was calm, steady, and devoid of the fear that gripped his heart. The voice on the other line was clinical and detached, a hospital administrator, informing him that his mother, Eleanor Callahan, had been admitted through the emergency room with severe respiratory distress and was in critical condition. Eleanor was 75, a retired history teacher who had spent her life preserving the stories of Port Sterling, Ohio, a woman of iron will wrapped in the gentle demeanor of a Midwestern matriarch. She did not simply stop breathing without cause. Jack ended the call, his movements shifting instantly from rest to tactical precision. He packed a single duffel bag with mechanical efficiency, grabbing only the essentials, while Kodiak, sensing the shift in his handler's energy, rose to his feet. The German shepherd moved with a fluid, wolf-like grace, his tail low and his body tense, ready for whatever command would come next. Jack secured emergency leave from a commanding officer who understood that for a man like Callahan, family was the only thing that ranked as high as country. And within the hour, they were in a rented truck speeding east as the rain blurred the world into streaks of gray and black. By the time they crossed the state line into Ohio, the storm had broken, leaving behind a crisp, heavy air that clung to the skin. Port Sterling appeared on the horizon, a city of stark, industrial beauty and deep, whispered secrets. It was a place where the past refused to die, where old brick buildings stood like silent sentinels and ancient sycamore trees lined the streets, their gnarled branches reaching out like the arms of old ghosts. The city smelled of the river, damp earth, and the faint, metallic tang of shuttered steel mills, a scent that usually brought Jack a sense of home. But tonight, it felt cloying and thick with decay. He steered the truck into the parking lot of St. Michael's Medical Center. The neon emergency sign buzzed with an erratic, sickly light that cast long, dancing shadows on the wet pavement. Kodiak remained glued to Jack's side as they exited the vehicle. The dog's posture was alert, his head high and ears pricked, scanning the environment for threats that human eyes might miss. They moved through the automatic doors and into the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the hospital where the smell of antiseptic waged a losing battle against the underlying odors of sickness and old fear. They were directed to a private room on the 4th floor. The hallway was quiet except for the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. Before entering, Jack was intercepted by Dr. Martin Shaw, the attending physician. Shaw was a thin, nervous man who seemed to shrink inside his white lab coat, constantly adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses on a beak-like nose. He looked at Jack, then down at the imposing German shepherd, and took a visible step back, his eyes darting around as if looking for an exit. The doctor explained in a tone that was both patronizing and dismissive that Eleanor had suffered an episode of acute respiratory failure, attributing it to the natural fragility of a woman her age. He used terms like geriatric decline and weakened constitution. His speech was rehearsed, lacking the genuine empathy of a healer. Jack listened in silence, his face a mask of stone, his piercing blue eyes dissecting every twitch of the doctor's face. He noted the way Shaw's hands trembled slightly as he held the clipboard, and the way he refused to meet Jack's gaze for more than a second. "She was struggling for air, Commander," Shaw said, his voice thin. "We have sedated her to let the body rest. At her age, the lungs just get tired." Jack gave a single curt nod, not trusting himself to speak, and pushed past the doctor into the room. The space was dim, illuminated only by the rhythmic green pulse of the heart monitor and the pale yellow light of a street lamp filtering through the blinds. Eleanor Callahan lay in the hospital bed, looking impossibly small. A fragile figure beneath the stark white sheets, her silver hair, usually pinned up in a neat, dignified bun, was spread loose across the pillow, framing a face that was pale and drawn. An oxygen mask covered her nose and mouth, misting with each shallow, labored breath. Jack pulled a heavy vinyl chair close to the bedside, the sound of the metal legs scraping against the floor echoing loudly in the silence, and took her hand in his. Her skin felt paper-thin and cold. As he gently rubbed her knuckles, trying to transfer his strength to her, his thumb grazed the inside of her wrist. He paused, his instinct screaming a warning. There, partially hidden by the plastic hospital ID bracelet, were faint reddish-purple marks. They were not the random blotches of old age or medical tape. They were distinct, oval-shaped bruises. They looked unmistakably like the imprint of fingers. A surge of cold, controlled fury, sharper than a blade, iced his veins. He leaned in closer, inspecting the marks without moving the bracelet, his mind racing through scenarios. Someone had grabbed her hard to restrain her. Just then, the door creaked open and a nurse bustled in. Her name tag read, Nurse Gable, a sturdy woman with a tight, frizzy perm and eyes that darted nervously around the room. She carried a tray of medications, her movements jerky and hurried. When she saw Kodiak sitting stoically at the foot of the bed, his dark eyes tracking her every motion, she gasped and nearly dropped the tray. "You shouldn't be in here with that beast," she stammered, her voice high and trembling. "It's against protocol. She needs rest." Kodiak let out a low, rumbling sound from deep within his chest. Not quite a growl, but a clear warning that vibrated through the room. Jack didn't look at the nurse. He kept his gaze fixed on his mother's face, his hand covering hers protectively. He is a service animal and a retired officer. Jack lied smoothly about the dog's retirement status, his voice a low baritone that left no room for argument. "He stays, and so do I." Nurse Gable swallowed hard, her face flushing, and she quickly checked the IV drip with shaking hands before hurrying out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The atmosphere in the room had shifted irrevocably. This wasn't just sickness. The doctor's nervous evasiveness, the specific bruising on her wrist that suggested a struggle, the nurse's palpable anxiety, it all painted a picture of a threat that was very much present. Jack realized with a sinking certainty that the enemy wasn't time or biology. The enemy was human, and they were likely still in the building. He stood up and moved the heavy armchair into the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest, positioning himself so he had a clear line of sight to both the door and the window. He was no longer just a son visiting a sick mother. He was a soldier on watch. He signaled to Kodiak, a subtle hand gesture that the German Shepherd understood instantly. The dog moved to the side of the bed, lying down parallel to Eleanor, his head resting on his front paws, but his ears swiveled toward the hallway. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane. Jack sat back, crossing his powerful arms over his chest, his eyes wide open in the semi-darkness. He wasn't going to sleep. He was going to wait. And if the Reaper came for Eleanor Callahan tonight, whether in the form of death or a man, he would have to go through the Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd first. The digital clock on the wall flickered to 3:17 a.m., the time known in folklore as the witching hour, when the veil between life and death is thinnest. The hospital wing had settled into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the hum of the ventilation system and the distant, rhythmic squeak of a janitor's cart down the hall. Commander Jack Callahan sat in the corner of the darkened room, his body rigid in the vinyl chair, fighting the gravitational pull of exhaustion. He had been awake for nearly 30 hours, fueled only by adrenaline and the fierce protective instinct that burned in his chest. Kodiak, the massive German Shepherd, lay at the foot of Eleanor's bed, his breathing shallow and even, though his ears twitched at every micro sound in the corridor. Eleanor was sleeping fitfully, her chest rising and falling in a jagged rhythm that Jack watched with obsessive focus. His throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper, and a dull headache was beginning to throb behind his eyes. He needed caffeine, hot water, anything to shock his system back to full alert. He looked at Kodiak, their bond communicating more than words ever could. "Watch," Jack whispered, a command that was barely a breath. Kodiak's amber eyes opened, locking onto Jack's face before shifting to the door. The dog didn't move a muscle, but his posture shifted from rest to readiness. Trusting his partner, Jack slipped out of the room, moving silently toward the nurse's station at the far end of the hall in search of a vending machine. Minutes after Jack disappeared around the corner, the heavy fire door to the stairwell creaked open. Out stepped a man who moved like a shadow detached from a wall. This was Corbin Lynch, known on the streets of Port Sterling as the Crow. He was a gaunt, skeletal figure, his skin a pallid gray that looked like it hadn't seen the sun in years. A tattoo of a coiling raven wound its way up his neck, its beak resting just below his left ear, a permanent warning to anyone who looked too closely. He wore a stolen set of teal hospital scrubs that hung loosely on his lanky frame, a generic ID badge clipped to his chest. Corbin was a cleaner, a man hired not for his brawn, but for his lack of conscience and his ability to make problems disappear. He had been watching the room for an hour, waiting for the large man to leave. He didn't know about the dog. From his vantage point, through the crack in the door earlier, the bed had obscured the sleeping shepherd. Corbin slipped into room 412, the soft click of the latch closing behind him sounding like a gunshot in the silence. He approached the bed with a predatory grin, looking down at the frail woman who held the deed to a fortune she didn't understand. "Time to go, old-timer," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Corbin didn't use a pillow. That was for movies. He preferred the intimacy of his own hands. He reached out, his long, spindly fingers splaying wide, and clamped his hand down hard over Eleanor Callahan's mouth and nose. Eleanor's eyes flew open, wide with terror and confusion. She tried to inhale, but the air was cut off, replaced by the smell of stale tobacco and sweat from the killer's palm. She thrashed weakly, her hands clawing at his forearm, but her strength was nothing against his leverage. She was drowning in dry air. Corbin leaned his weight into her, his eyes cold and dead, watching the life flicker in hers. He was enjoying the power of it, so focused on her fading struggle that he didn't hear the low, guttural growl that started from the floor. A sound like tectonic plates grinding together. Kodiak launched. He didn't bark. He exploded from his position with the velocity of a missile. 100 pounds of muscle and fury collided with Corbin's side. The German Shepherd's jaws, capable of exerting over 200 pounds of pressure, snapped shut around Corbin's right forearm, the arm pressing down on Eleanor. There was a sickening crunch of bone-meeting teeth. Corbin shrieked, a high-pitched sound of pure agony that shattered the hospital's quiet. He tried to shake the dog off, but Kodiak was a vice, his back paws scrabbling for traction on the linoleum as he thrashed his head, tearing at the limb. The force of the attack yanked Corbin away from the bed, sending him crashing into the fourth stand, which toppled with a deafening clatter of metal and glass. "Get off! Get it off!" Corbin screamed, striking at the dog's head with his free hand. But Kodiak was impervious to pain, his protective drive overriding everything. He released the arm, only to lunge again, this time snapping at Corbin's shoulder, driving the assassin back toward the window. Jack was halfway back from the vending machine when he heard the scream. He dropped the cup of coffee, the hot liquid splashing across his boots, and sprinted. He didn't run like a jogger. He ran like a battering ram, covering the length of the hallway in seconds. He burst into the room just as Corbin managed to kick Kodiak in the ribs, momentarily creating space. Jack took in the scene in a nanosecond, his mother gasping for air, the overturned equipment, the blood on the floor, and the man with the raven tattoo trying to pull a knife from his waistband. Jack didn't slow down. He hit Corbin with the force of a freight train, his shoulder driving into the man's solar plexus. The air left Corbin's lungs in a wet wheeze. Jack spun him around, grabbing the wrist of the hand reaching for the knife and twisting it violently upward. The sound of the wrist snapping was distinct and brutal. Corbin dropped the knife, his knees buckling. Jack slammed him face first against the wall, pinning him there with a forearm pressed against the back of his neck. "Kodiak. Hold!" Jack commanded, his voice thunderous. The dog instantly stopped his advance, standing guard between the bed and the combatants, teeth bared, chest heaving. "Who sent you?" Jack growled into Corbin's ear, increasing the pressure on his neck. "Give me a name and you might leave here walking." Corbin spat blood onto the wall, wheezing, a twisted smile forming on his face. You have no idea." Suddenly, the door burst open. "Security, back away." The shout came from a man who filled the doorway. This was Security Chief Henderson, the head of hospital security. But he looked more like a bouncer for a dive bar. He was a beefy, sweating man with a uniform that strained at the buttons and a face flushed red with exertion or perhaps something else. He held a baton in his hand, his eyes scanning the room. Instead of assessing the situation, his gaze locked onto Jack. "I said, back off him." Henderson roared, ignoring the knife on the floor and the terrified woman in the bed. He lunged forward, not to arrest the intruder, but to pull Jack off Corbin. Henderson grabbed Jack's shoulder, shoving him hard. "Assaulting a patient." "I saw it." Henderson lied, creating chaos. Jack turned, his combat instincts flaring. He shoved Henderson back easily, but the split-second distraction was all Corbin needed. Despite his mangled arm and broken wrist, the assassin was fueled by the desperate adrenaline of a trapped rat. He scrambled away from the wall, grabbing a heavy metal chair and flinging it into the window. The glass shattered outward into the rainy night. The room was on the second floor, overlooking a low concrete awning above the ambulance bay. It was a risky drop, but Corbin didn't hesitate. He dove through the jagged opening, tumbling out into the darkness just as Jack lunged to grab his ankle, his fingers brushing the fabric of the scrubs before Corbin disappeared. Jack looked out the window. He saw Corbin roll on the awning, limp for a second, then slide off the edge to the ground below, limping away into the shadows of the parking lot before disappearing into a waiting black sedan. Henderson was now shouting into his radio, calling for backup, painting Jack as the aggressor. Jack ignored him, turning his back on the corrupt guard. He moved instantly to his mother's side. Eleanor was trembling violently, clutching her throat, her eyes wide with shock. Kodiak nudged her hand with his wet nose, whining softly, the fierce warrior gone, replaced by the gentle guardian. Jack brushed the hair from her forehead, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the empty window, then at the incompetent, sweating security guard who was purposely blocking the door. The game had changed. This wasn't a random attack. It was a hit. And now Jack knew the enemy had people inside the walls. He looked at Henderson with eyes cold enough to freeze fire. "You let him go," Jack said quietly. "Remember that choice, because I won't forget it." The drive from St. Michael's Medical Center to the outskirts of the historic district was a tense, silent journey undertaken in the pre-dawn gloom. Jack had discharged his mother against medical advice, signing the paperwork with a hand that shook not from fear, but from the effort of restraining his rage at Dr. Shaw, who had stuttered protests while avoiding Jack's gaze. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a compromised zone. Jack drove the rental truck with one hand on the wheel and his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for a tail while Kodiak sat in the back seat, his head resting gently on Eleanor's lap. Eleanor, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket despite the humid Ohio air, looked out the window at the passing brick facades of the old industrial buildings. She didn't speak, but her grip on Kodiak's fur was white-knuckled. They were heading to the Callahan ancestral home, a place that had stood on the bluff overlooking the river since the turn of the 20th century. It was more than a house. It was a repository of memory, a fortress of history that Jack had not visited in years, but which still pulled at his blood like the tide. The house emerged from the mist as they turned onto the gravel driveway, a sprawling Victorian structure of weathered white clapboard and black shutters, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that had rusted into a stubborn, jagged barrier. The porch wrapped around the house like a protective arm, and the windows, tall and narrow, stared back at them with the familiarity of old friends. This was the house where Jack had learned to walk, where he had scraped his knees, and where he had learned what it meant to be a man. He carried Eleanor up the steps, bypassing the creaking third board he remembered from childhood, and settled her onto the velvet sofa in the library. The room smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and the faint, lingering tobacco smoke of his father's pipe, a scent that had somehow survived 2 decades since the colonel's passing. Jack didn't sit down. The moment Eleanor was safe, the sun vanished and the commander took over. He moved through the house with lethal efficiency, treating the childhood home as a forward operating base. He checked every window, engaging the old brass locks and wedging sturdy pieces of oak firewood into the frames to prevent them from being shimmied open. He moved heavy furniture in front of the unused side doors, creating physical barricades that would buy them time and noise if breached. Kodiak was deployed to the perimeter. "Patrol," Jack commanded, pointing to the overgrown garden that lay between the house and the river bluff. The German shepherd trotted out into the yard, moving silently through the rose bushes, his nose skimming the earth. He was not just a dog in a yard. He was a sensor array, a biological alarm system that would detect a heartbeat long before Jack saw a face. Inside, Jack went to the mantel above the fireplace, where an oil painting of his father, Colonel Robert Callahan, hung in a gilt frame. The colonel was depicted in his dress blues, his jaw set in the same stubborn line that Jack saw in the mirror every morning. Robert Callahan had been a man of rigid moral code, a soldier who believed that duty was not a choice but a condition of existence. Jack touched the frame, a silent communion with the ghost of the man who had taught him that a man's worth is measured by what he defends. He felt a sudden, crushing weight of responsibility. He wasn't just defending a building. He was defending the legacy of the Callahan line, a family that had bled for this soil. He pulled the heavy curtains shut, sealing them in a dim, amber-lit cocoon. Jack returned to the library with a cup of hot tea, heavily sweetened, just the way Eleanor liked it. She was sitting up now, her breathing easier, though the bruising on her face was a stark, angry purple against her pale skin. She took the cup with trembling hands, taking a long sip before looking at her son with eyes that had regained their steel. You need to know why, Jack, she said, her voice raspy but firm. This wasn't a robbery. That man, that creature in the hospital, he didn't ask for money. Jack sat on the ottoman across from her, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. I know, Mom. He was a professional, or a cheap imitation of one. Who hired him? Eleanor set the tea down and reached into the hidden compartment of the antique secretary desk next to the sofa. Her fingers, gnarled with arthritis but sure in their movement, triggered a spring-loaded drawer. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound folio. The leather was cracked and worn with age. It's not who, Jack. It's what they want. She opened the folio to reveal a set of yellowed, fragile parchments. The ink was faded to brown, but still legible. They were land deeds, original grants dating back to the founding of the state, signed with the flourish of Ohio's first governors. These papers proved that the 20 acres of riverfront property, the land that the city claims is blighted and abandoned, is actually a protected historical trust, deeded to the Historical Society in perpetuity by your great-grandfather, Eleanor explained, her voice gaining strength. Mayor Richard Davenport has been trying to suppress this for 2 years. He has a deal with a developer from Las Vegas to build a massive casino and resort complex right on top of the old Pioneer burial grounds. They call it the Riverbend Plaza. I call it a desecration. Jack took the documents, handling them as if they were live explosives. He scanned the legal language. It was airtight. As long as these papers existed and were recognized, the mayor's multi-million-dollar kickback scheme was dead in the water. Davenport came to see me last week, Eleanor continued, her eyes flashing with anger. He offered me a fortune to lose these papers. When I refused, he told me that accidents happen to old women living alone in big houses. He said, progress has a way of crushing the past. Jack looked up from the documents, a cold realization settling over him. Corbin Lynch wasn't just a thug, he was the mayor's eraser. And Mayor Davenport wasn't just a corrupt politician. He was a domestic enemy. He was willing to murder a 75-year-old teacher and pave over the graves of patriots to build a slot machine palace. This was an erasure of history, a betrayal of everything his father had fought for and everything Jack had sworn to protect. The attack in the hospital was just the opening salvo. They would come back. They had to. As long as Eleanor breathed and those papers existed, the mayor's empire was built on sand. Jack stood up, walking to the window and peering through the crack in the curtains. Outside, Kodiak stood like a stone statue near the gate, his ears pricked forward. The enemy was out there, comfortable in their offices and their black sedans, thinking they were dealing with a helpless old woman and her dog. They had no idea they had just awakened a sleeping giant. Jack turned back to his mother, his face calm, terrifyingly serene. Let them come, he said softly. This house stood through the Great Flood of 1913. It'll hold against Richard Davenport. He wasn't just a son anymore. He was the garrison commander of the Callahan estate, and the war had just come home. The afternoon sun hung low and heavy over Port Sterling, casting long, bruised shadows across the asphalt as Commander Jack Callahan guided his rental truck away from the secluded sanctuary of the Callahan estate. Leaving his mother was a calculated risk, a tactical gamble that gnawed at his gut. But he had turned the Victorian home into a fortress, barring the doors with heavy oak furniture and setting primitive but effective noise traps at every entry point. Most importantly, he had left Kodiak behind. The German Shepherd understood his orders with a clarity that surpassed human language. Guard meant that nothing short of a tank would get within 10 feet of Eleanor Callahan without facing a fury of teeth and muscle. Jack needed intel, and for that, he needed to step out of the shadows and into the neon-lit world of the living. His destination was the Portside Diner, a local institution since the Eisenhower administration, located on the fringes of the city, where the revitalization projects hadn't yet reached. It was neutral ground, a place where the coffee was strong enough to strip paint and the secrets were buried under layers of grease and gossip. He pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching loudly under his tires, and scanned the area. The diner was a gleaming capsule of 1960s nostalgia that seemed frozen in time. Its chrome exterior reflected the hazy Ohio sky. The red and white neon sign buzzed with a persistent electric hum. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of frying bacon, brewing coffee, and the lingering perfume of cigarette smoke that had seeped into the vinyl booths decades ago. Jack spotted his contact immediately. Sitting in the furthest booth, her back to the wall and her eyes scanning the entrance, was Judge Evelyn Reed. Evelyn was a legend in the county legal system, a woman known affectionately and fearfully as the Iron Gavel. At 78, she possessed a formidable presence that withered attorneys half her age. She was dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit that defied the humidity, a silk scarf knotted precisely at her throat. Her hair was a helmet of steel gray curls, immobile and perfect, and her face was a map of deep lines etched by years of listening to lies and passing judgment. She held a lit cigarette in one hand, ignoring the no smoking sign above her head, and a cup of black coffee in the other. Jack slid into the booth opposite her, the red vinyl creaking under his weight. Evelyn didn't smile, but her eyes, sharp and dark like polished obsidian, softened slightly as she took in his face. "You have Robert's jaw," she said, her voice a gravelly contralto that sounded like tires on a dirt road. "And Eleanor's stubbornness in the eyes. It's a dangerous combination, Jack." She took a drag of her cigarette, blowing the smoke to the side with a practiced elegance. "I heard about the hospital. The official report says a delirious patient and an aggressive dog caused a disturbance. Henderson filed it this morning." Jack leaned in, keeping his voice low, indistinguishable from the background noise of the jukebox playing a low, mournful country ballad. "It wasn't a disturbance, Evelyn. It was an assassination attempt. A man named Corbin Lynch tried to suffocate her. If Kodiak hadn't been there, Mom would be in the morgue right now, listed as a cardiac failure." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her grip on the coffee cup tightened until her knuckles turned white. She reached into her structured leather handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the formica table. "I believe you," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because she isn't the first, and if we don't act, she won't be the last." Jack opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of death certificates, photocopied and stapled together with property deeds. He flipped through them, his eyes scanning the data with the speed of an intelligence analyst. The names were different: Walter Peterson, Helen Croft, George Miller. But the pattern was a terrifying duplicate of his mother's situation. "These are all elderly homeowners," Evelyn explained, tapping a manicured fingernail on the table. "They all own property along the riverfront, specifically on the land Davenport needs for his casino's access road and parking structures. Look at the dates, Jack." He looked. Walter Peterson, age 82, died of respiratory failure at St. Michael's on March 12. His property was sold by his estranged nephew to a shell corporation the next day. Helen Croft, aged 79, died of a sudden stroke in her sleep at the same hospital on April 4. Her historic cottage was bulldozed a week later. There were 6 names in total, 6 lives extinguished quietly, professionally, under the guise of natural causes. Dr. Shaw signed 5 of these death certificates, Jack noted, his voice cold. And the 6th was signed by a resident under his supervision. Evelyn nodded grimly. "Davenport has the police chief in his pocket, Jack. He has the zoning board, the hospital administrators, and the local press. I've tried to block the land transfers in probate court, but files go missing, clerks get bribed, and suddenly the deeds are clean. I'm the only judge left who hasn't taken his campaign contributions, which is just a polite word for blood money. But I'm old, and I'm alone. I can't fight an army." Jack looked up from the papers, the reality of the situation settling over him like a lead vest. This wasn't just corruption. It was a systematic culling of the vulnerable. Davenport wasn't just a thief. He was a serial killer by proxy, using men like Corbin Lynch as his weapon and the hospital as his killing floor. The realization hit Jack that his mother's survival was a miraculous anomaly, a glitch in Davenport's perfect murder machine caused entirely by the presence of a German shepherd who refused to sleep. "They are going to come back," Jack said, the statement hanging in the air. "They can't afford to let her live. She's the only one left who can prove the land is protected." Evelyn crushed her cigarette out in the overflowing ashtray, her eyes locking onto his. "They will come back harder," she warned. "Davenport is desperate. The investors for the Riverbend project are coming to town in 3 days for the groundbreaking ceremony. If he doesn't have the title to clear his land by then, the deal collapses, and he owes dangerous men a lot of money. He's backed into a corner, and a cornered rat is the most vicious thing on God's green earth." She reached across the table and placed her hand over Jack's. Her skin was dry and cool, her rings feeling hard against his skin. "You're a Navy SEAL, Jack. You know war, but this isn't a battlefield with rules of engagement. This is a swamp. If you trust the police, they will arrest you. If you trust the hospital, they will kill her. You are on your own." Jack turned his hand over and squeezed hers gently, a silent vow passing between them. He thought of Eleanor waiting in the dim library, trusting him to save her. He thought of the 6 names on the table, ghosts crying out for justice. "I'm not on my own," Jack said, a dark intensity burning in his eyes. "I have Kodiak, and now I have a target list." He gathered the papers, sliding them back into the envelope. "You stay safe, Evelyn. Don't go to the courthouse tomorrow. Call in sick." Evelyn let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "I've never called in sick a day in my life, Commander. I'll be on the bench. Someone has to be there to sign the warrants when you bring me the evidence." Jack stood up, the vinyl booth releasing him with a squeak. He looked down at the iron gavel, admiring her unyielding spine. She was a relic of a Port Sterling that was fading, a city of honor and grit, and he would burn the whole corrupt system down to preserve it. He walked out of the diner, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully, a stark contrast to the storm of violence he was about to unleash. The sun had set, and the neon lights of the diner reflected in the puddles of the parking lot like pools of electric blood. He climbed into his truck, the engine roaring to life, and turned back toward the Callahan estate. The intel was gathered. The enemy was identified. The mission parameters had shifted from rescue to retribution. Mayor Davenport wanted a war for the soul of the city, and Jack Callahan was more than happy to give him one. The storm that had been threatening Port Sterling all day finally broke with the fury of a biblical deluge. Thunder rattled the window panes of the Callahan ancestral home, vibrating through the floorboards like the footsteps of giants, while lightning tore the sky apart in jagged, blinding sheets of white. The rain was a solid curtain of water, drumming against the old Victorian siding and drowning out the cacophony of the city, isolating the estate on its lonely bluff overlooking the river. Inside, the house was plunged into darkness. Commander Jack Callahan had cut the main breaker hours ago, turning the sprawling residence into a cavern of shadows, where he held the tactical advantage. He sat in the center of the foyer, his breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the storm, his eyes adjusted to the gloom. He wore dark tactical clothing, his boots laced tight, his hands wrapped in protective tape. He carried no firearm. To shoot an intruder in this county was to invite a police investigation led by a chief who was on Mayor Davenport's payroll. A dead body was a legal nightmare that could see Eleanor arrested or the house seized as a crime scene. No, tonight required a surgeon's precision, not a soldier's firepower. He would dismantle them piece by piece, using the house itself as his weapon. Eleanor was safe, locked in the reinforced root cellar beneath the kitchen with a heavy oak wardrobe dragged over the trapdoor, a thermos of tea, and strict instructions not to make a sound until Jack came for her. Outside, in the churning mud of the overgrown garden, Kodiak was on the hunt. The German Shepherd was invisible in the downpour, a phantom of wet fur and bared teeth. He moved low to the ground, his paws silent on the sodden earth, his senses screaming with the scent of intruders. There were 4 of them. They had parked their vehicle down the road to avoid detection, approaching on foot through the marsh, smelling of cheap tobacco, gasoline, and nervous sweat. Leading the pack was Corbin Lynch, his right arm encased in a heavy plaster cast from their last encounter, his face a mask of twisted vengeance. Flanking him were 2 new recruits hired from the bottom of the criminal barrel. To his left was Hammer Hanks, a hulking wall of a man with a shaved head and knuckles scarred from countless bar fights, carrying a heavy crowbar. To his right was a twitchy, wiry man known as Flicker Finn, who clutched 2 red jerry cans of gasoline to his chest like precious infants. Flicker had a history of arson and a face marred by old burned scars, his eyes darting frantically at every flash of lightning. Spread out, Lynch hissed over the roar of the rain, gesturing with his good hand toward the dark house. "Burn it down. If the old hag is inside, she burns with it. No witnesses." Flicker giggled nervously and hurried toward the side of the house, intending to douse the wooden porch supports. He never made it. As he passed a dense cluster of rose bushes, a shadow separated itself from the darkness. Kodiak didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply launched. He hit Flicker from the blind side, his jaws locking onto the man's calf. Flicker shrieked, dropping the gas cans as he was dragged violently into the bushes. The scream was swallowed by a perfectly timed clap of thunder. Hammer turned, squinting into the rain. "Flicker!" he called out, gripping his crowbar. "Quit playing around." There was no answer, only the sound of rain hissing on the grass and a low, wet, dragging noise. Hammer took a step toward the bushes, raising his weapon. Suddenly, something heavy and fast struck his legs. Kodiak, using his momentum to bowl the large man over. As Hammer hit the mud, Kodiak was on top of him. A snarling demon inches from his face, delivering a terrifying, controlled snap of his jaws near the man's throat before vanishing back into the dark. Hammer scrambled backward, crab walking through the mud, terror seizing his heart. He dropped the crowbar and ran, abandoning his paycheck and his pride, sprinting for the road without looking back. Inside, Jack heard the commotion, or rather, the lack of it. The garden was secure. Now it was time for the main event. The front door lock clicked, picked by a specialized tool Lynch held in his good hand. The door creaked open, admitting a gust of wind and rain. Lynch stepped into the foyer, followed by the 4th man, a generic thug with a baseball bat who looked like he regretted taking the job. "Pour the gas in the hall," Lynch commanded, his voice echoing in the empty house. "Light it up." The thug stepped forward, raising a can of accelerant he had picked up from the porch. He took one step onto the rug Jack had carefully positioned. Underneath the rug, Jack had scattered a handful of glass marbles from his childhood collection. Simple, crude, effective. The thug's boot hit the marbles and his feet flew out from under him. He crashed hard onto his back, his head hitting the floor with a sickening thud. He groaned once and went limp, unconscious. Lynch spun around, his eyes wild, pulling a heavy, rusted lighter from his pocket. "Show yourself." He screamed into the darkness, the lighter flaring to life in his shaking hand. "I know you're here." From the shadows of the grand staircase, a voice emerged, calm and cold as the grave. "You should have stayed away, Lynch." Jack stepped into the faint light of the open door. He didn't rush. He walked with the terrifying casualness of a predator who has already trapped his prey. Lynch, panic overriding his pain, lunged forward, trying to throw the lit lighter onto the spilled gasoline near the unconscious thug. Jack moved. He closed the distance in a blur of motion, intercepting the throw. He caught Lynch's wrist midair, the same wrist he had broken days ago, now held together by a brace. He squeezed. Lynch howled, dropping the lighter. Jack caught it before it hit the floor, flicking the lid closed with his thumb in one smooth motion. Lynch swung his cast like a club, aiming for Jack's head. It was a desperate, clumsy move. Jack ducked under the swing, stepping into Lynch's guard. He drove a palm strike into Lynch's chin, snapping the man's head back, then swept his legs. Lynch hit the floor hard, the wind knocked out of him. Before he could scramble away, Jack was on him, flipping him onto his stomach. He grabbed Lynch's good arm and the cast, pulling them behind his back. He pulled a pair of heavy-duty plastic flex cuffs from his belt, standard SEAL issue for prisoner transport, and zipped them tight around Lynch's wrists, effectively immobilizing him. Lynch thrashed, spitting curses into the floorboards. "You're dead, Callahan. Davenport will skin you alive." Jack leaned down, whispering into Lynch's ear. "Davenport isn't here, and you're not going to burn this house. You're going to save it." Just then, Kodiak appeared in the doorway, wet and muddy, looking like a mythical beast risen from the swamp. He trotted over to Jack, nudging his hand. Jack patted the dog's head, checking him for injuries. "Good boy," he murmured. He hauled Lynch to his feet, dragging the struggling assassin over to a heavy armchair and shoving him down. He used a second pair of cuffs to secure Lynch's ankles to the chair legs. "You are going to sit right here until the sun comes up," Jack told him. "And then you and I are going to have a very long conversation about ledgers, dates, and Mayor Davenport's retirement plans." Lynch looked at the dog, then at the man, and for the first time, the arrogance in his eyes was replaced by the hollow, crushing realization of defeat. The storm raged on outside, battering the walls of the Callahan estate, but inside, the threat had been neutralized. The ghosts of the house settled back into the woodwork, satisfied. The fortress had held. The first light of dawn filtered through the heavy curtains of the Callahan library, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and the defeated slump of Corbin Lynch's shoulders. The assassin had spent the last 4 hours tied to the armchair, his endurance stripped away not by torture, but by the terrifying silent patience of Jack Callahan. Jack hadn't touched him since the fight. He had simply sat across from him, cleaning his fingernails with a tactical knife, occasionally looking up to ask, "Where is it?" Finally, as the sun began to warm the room, Lynch broke. His voice was a cracked whisper, devoid of his earlier arrogance. He revealed that Mayor Davenport was paranoid, a man who didn't trust digital clouds or bank vaults. Davenport kept his insurance, the raw audio recordings of his illegal orders and the digital ledgers of his bribes, in a place he could see from his office window every day. A place no one would think to look because it was hidden in the beating heart of the city itself. The City Hall clock tower, Lynch wheezed, inside the maintenance hatch of the main pendulum. He calls it controlling the time. Jack verified the location details, then left Lynch secured for the authorities. He couldn't go in as Commander Callahan, the tactical operator, that would draw immediate attention from Davenport's police force. He had to become someone else. He rummaged through his old closet, finding a faded Ohio State baseball cap and a slightly oversized windbreaker. He swapped his combat boots for worn sneakers and hung a tourist camera around his neck. Kodiak, sensing the change in energy, stood ready. Jack attached a standard leather leash to the dog's collar, removing the tactical vest. They weren't a SEAL team anymore. They were just a man and his dog taking a morning stroll through the historic district. The target was the Port Sterling City Hall, a magnificent structure with a copper dome that gleamed under the morning sun. Located at the head of Market Street, it was a public building bustling with tourists and civil servants, which made it the perfect hiding spot and a nightmare to infiltrate. They arrived at the plaza just as the city was waking up. The air was already thick with humidity and the smell of roasting coffee from nearby cafes. Jack adopted a relaxed, meandering gait, his shoulders slumped slightly to hide his military posture. He stopped to look at statues, pointing things out to Kodiak, blending seamlessly into the flow of foot traffic. His eyes, however, were scanning the perimeter with laser focus. The entrance to the clock tower maintenance stairs was located in the rear lobby, past a security checkpoint guarded by a single officer. Jack adjusted his sunglasses, spotting the obstacle. The guard was a man named Officer Kowalski. Kowalski was a heavyset man in his late 50s with a uniform that looked a size too small and a face that radiated supreme boredom. He was currently more interested in the crossword puzzle on his desk than the people walking by. But the metal detector archway he manned was active. Jack couldn't walk through there with his lock-picking tools, and he couldn't just walk past Kowalski. He needed a diversion that was loud, innocent, and chaotic enough to pull Kowalski away from his post for exactly 30 seconds. Jack knelt down next to Kodiak, pretending to tie his shoe. "Kodiak," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Distract." He unclipped the leash. Kodiak understood. The German shepherd trotted away from Jack, heading toward a display of velvet ropes and brass stanchions near the main rotunda, about 50 feet from the guard desk. Kodiak sniffed the base of a stand, then let out a sharp, inquisitive bark. He began to paw at the heavy brass base, knocking it over with a loud clang that echoed through the marble hall. Then, acting with the playful energy of a puppy, Kodiak grabbed the velvet rope and began to tug, pulling down 2 more stanchions in a domino effect of crashing metal. Hey, get that dog out of here!" Officer Kowalski shouted, dropping his pen. He hauled himself out of his chair, his face flushing red as he waddled quickly toward the out-of-control animal. "Whose dog is this?" "Hey!" Kodiak danced just out of reach, barking happily, leading Kowalski further away from the maintenance door. The lobby turned to watch the spectacle. In that moment of confusion, Jack moved. He didn't run. He power-walked. A ghost in the crowd, slipping past the unmanned desk and ducking into the narrow alcove behind the elevators. He found the door marked maintenance, authorized personnel only. The lock was an old wafer tumbler, laughable for someone with his training. He used a small tension wrench and a rake pick he had concealed in his camera strap. Click. The door opened. He slipped inside and closed it softly just as he heard Kowalski yelling, "Come here, you mutt." The air inside the tower shaft was stagnant, smelling of grease, dust, and old wood. A spiral iron staircase wound its way up into the gloom, surrounded by the massive gears and pulleys of the clock mechanism. The sound here was deafening, a rhythmic thrum-click that vibrated through the soles of Jack's sneakers. He began the climb, moving fast. The heat rose with every step, the ventilation non-existent. He reached the top platform, a small wooden gantry suspended amidst the giant cogs of the clock face. Sunlight sliced through the gaps in the clock numbers, illuminating dust particles that swirled like galaxies. In the center of the room swung the massive brass pendulum, a metronome of history that had kept time for a century. It swung with lethal force, a heavy arc that could crush bone. Jack timed the swing. Left, right, left. He saw it. On the side of the pendulum's counterweight, there was a small, almost invisible seam. It was a maintenance hatch used for adding lead weights to adjust the time. He had to catch it mid-swing. Jack braced himself against the railing. He waited for the pendulum to reach the apex of its swing toward him. Now. He lunged, his hand moving with the speed of a striking cobra. He grabbed the small latch, popped it open, and reached into the hollow cavity. His fingers brushed against cold metal, not lead, but a small, taped object. He grabbed it and yanked his hand back just as the pendulum swung away, the heavy brass missing his fingers by millimeters. He exhaled, a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. In his palm sat a black USB drive wrapped in electrical tape. He pulled out a small adapter, plugging it into his phone to verify the contents. He tapped a file named Eleanor. Wave. The voice of Mayor Davenport filled the dusty tower, tiny but unmistakable. "I don't care how you do it, Lynch. Make it look like a heart attack. Just make sure that old woman stops breathing before the investors land." It was the smoking gun. It was the end of Davenport's reign. Jack pocketed the drive, securing it in a zippered pocket. The descent was faster. He reached the bottom of the stairs and pressed his ear to the door. He could hear Kowalski's voice, winded and annoyed, back at the desk. "Damn tourists can't control their pets. Jack waited for the sound of the elevator dings to mask his exit. He slipped out, blending instantly back into a group of tourists exiting an elevator. He walked to the main entrance where Kodiak was waiting by the door, sitting politely as if he had been there the whole time, looking at Officer Kowalski with an expression of pure innocence. Jack clipped the leash back on. "Good boy," he whispered, scratching Kodiak behind the ears. They walked out into the blinding Ohio sun, the weight of the USB drive in his pocket feeling heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. They had the proof. Now they just needed a stage to present it. The midday sun beat down on the brick pavers of Market Square with a relentless, humid intensity, baking the heart of Port Sterling in a shimmering haze of heat and patriotism. It was the city's Founders' Day festival, a celebration of history that Mayor Richard Davenport had ironically chosen as the stage to announce the groundbreaking of his Riverbend Plaza project. The square was a sea of red, white, and blue bunting, with a massive wooden stage erected in front of the white marble monument of a Civil War general. A brass band played a rousing, slightly off-key rendition of Stars and Stripes Forever, competing with the chatter of hundreds of attendees. The crowd was largely comprised of the city's older generation, retired teachers, war veterans in garrison caps adorned with pins, and grandmothers fanning themselves with church programs. They sat in rows of folding chairs, their faces upturned toward the podium, trusting in the leadership of their city. In the center of the stage stood Mayor Richard Davenport. He was a man who looked as though he had been manufactured for politics, with perfectly coiffed silver hair that didn't move in the breeze, teeth capped in a blinding shade of white, and a navy blue suit that cost more than most of the attendees made in a year. He gripped the sides of the podium, projecting an image of benevolent authority, though a sheen of sweat on his upper lip betrayed his nerves. "My friends, my neighbors." Davenport's voice boomed through the massive speaker towers flanking the stage, smooth as silk and just as slippery. "For too long, our riverfront has been a graveyard of the past, decaying, forgotten. But today, we turn the page. With the Riverbend Plaza, we are not destroying history. We are monetizing it. We are building a future where luxury and tradition meet." He paused for applause, but the clapping was polite, sparse. The people of Port Sterling knew the value of their history, and they were wary of change that came wrapped in shiny packaging. Lurking in the shadow of the massive oak trees at the edge of the square, Commander Jack Callahan watched the performance with icy detachment. He was no longer dressed in the disguise of a tourist. Today he wore his full-service dress white uniform, the pristine fabric stark against the gloom of the shade, his ribbons and warfare insignia gleaming in the dappled light. At his side, Kodiak sat at perfect attention, his black and tan coat brushed to a shine, a ceremonial American flag bandana tied loosely around his neck. They looked like a recruiting poster brought to life, a symbol of everything Davenport was not: honorable, disciplined, and real. Jack moved toward the audiovisual tent located directly behind the stage. The area was guarded by two bored local police officers, but they were busy watching the mayor, their backs to the tent flaps. Jack didn't need to sneak past them. He walked right up to them. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the effortless command of a senior officer. The cops spun around, startled. Before they could reach for their radios, Jack flashed his military ID, holding it steady. "I'm here for the security sweep of the sound system. Federal protocol for large gatherings." It was a bluff, but Jack sold it with such absolute conviction that the officers, conditioned to respect the uniform, stepped aside. Sure thing, Commander. Go ahead." Jack stepped into the tent. Inside, a young sound technician named Kevin, a skinny kid with headphones around his neck and a Save the Cuyahoga t-shirt, looked up in alarm. "Who are you? You can't be back here." Jack placed a finger to his lips, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the black USB drive. "I'm not here to hurt you, son," Jack said gently. "I'm here to fix a technical error in the mayor's speech." He moved Kevin aside firmly, but without aggression, plugging the drive into the main mixing board. He found the master override channel. On stage, Davenport was reaching his crescendo. "This project requires sacrifice," Davenport shouted, raising a fist. "But it is a sacrifice we make for the greater good, for the elderly, for the..." Jack hit the play button. The sound that erupted from the massive speakers was not music, and it wasn't the mayor's voice. At least, not the one speaking into the microphone. It was a recording, crackling with static but deafeningly clear, amplified to a volume that shook the leaves off the trees. "I don't care how you do it, Lynch." The disembodied voice of Richard Davenport snarled, echoing off the historic buildings surrounding the square. The real Davenport froze on stage, his mouth hanging open mid-word. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the square. The recording continued, merciless and damning. Make it look like a heart attack. Just make sure that old woman stops breathing before the investors land. Suffocate her if you have to. Silence descended on Market Square, absolute and heavy, broken only by the hum of the speakers. Every eye was fixed on the mayor. Davenport's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He tapped the microphone frantically. Technical difficulties. He shrieked, his voice cracking. This is a hack. Deepfake. Turn it off. But the audio had stopped, leaving his panic exposed for the world to see. From the side of the stage, Jack Callahan walked out. He didn't run. He marched. The sound of his dress shoes on the wooden planks was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of judgment. Kodiak walked at his heel, head high, looking like a wolf of justice. A murmur went through the crowd. The veterans recognized the uniform, the rank, the bearing. They stood up one by one, their old joints creaking, forming a wall of witnesses. Jack stopped at the center of the stage, taking the microphone from a paralyzed Davenport. He didn't look at the politician. He looked at the crowd. My name is Commander Jack Callahan, United States Navy, Jack said, his voice calm, deep, and resonating with truth. The woman he ordered to be killed is my mother, Eleanor Callahan. She is 75 years old. She taught half of you history in high school. A gasp of recognition rippled through the audience. This man, Jack gestured to the trembling mayor, tried to murder her to steal land that belongs to history, to steal land that belongs to you. Davenport lunged at Jack, a desperate, animalistic attempt to grab the mic. You liar. Arrest him. Kodiak moved. He stepped between Jack and the mayor, letting out a bark that sounded like a cannon shot. He didn't bite. He stood his ground, his hackles raised, a living barrier of moral force. Davenport stumbled back, terrified of the dog, terrified of the man, and terrified of the truth. That is enough, Mr. Mayor. The voice came from the back of the stage. Emerging from the wings was not the corrupt local police chief, but a phalanx of 6 men in crisp gray uniforms and broad-brimmed hats. Leading them was Captain Evans of the Ohio State Highway Patrol. Captain Evans was a mountain of a man with a face like tanned leather and sunglasses that hid his eyes, but not his intent. He walked with the heavy, inevitable stride of the law. The local police, realizing the wind had shifted, stayed back, unwilling to interfere with state troopers. Evans walked up to Davenport, who was now weeping, babbling excuses about investors and pressure. Evans didn't listen. He spun the mayor around, pulling his expensive wrists behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was amplified by the microphone Jack was still holding, a sharp snick that sounded like the closing of a cell door. Richard Davenport, Captain Evans announced, his voice carrying to the back of the square without need of amplification. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, real estate fraud, and racketeering. As the troopers marched the sobbing mayor off the stage, the crowd erupted. It wasn't a cheer of joy, but a roar of vindication. The veterans in the front row snapped to attention, saluting Jack as he stood on the stage. Jack returned the salute, slow and precise. He looked down at Kodiak, who was wagging his tail, sensing the tension had drained from his handler. The Riverbend Plaza was dead. The history of the city was safe. Jack looked out at the sea of white hair and weathered faces, the people his mother had championed, and felt a profound sense of peace. He hadn't used a gun. He hadn't thrown a punch. He had simply turned on the light, and the cockroaches had scattered. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic confrontation in Market Square, and the transformation of the Callahan estate was nothing short of miraculous. The heavy oak furniture had been moved back to its proper place. The windows were unbarred, and the air of siege warfare that had permeated the Victorian home had been replaced by the lazy, golden drift of an Ohio Sunday afternoon. The storm that had raged both in the sky and in the heart of the city had finally broken, leaving behind a world that felt scrubbed clean, brighter, and infinitely lighter. Commander Jack Callahan stood on the edge of the sprawling front lawn, dressed not in tactical gear or a dress uniform, but in a pair of worn denim jeans and a simple gray t-shirt that stretched across his broad chest. He held a weathered tennis ball in his hand, looking out over the Ohio River. The water, once ominous and dark in his mind, now sparkled like a field of crushed diamonds under the October sun. It was a good day. It was a quiet day. And for the first time in 20 years of service, Jack didn't feel the itch to be somewhere else. He had made his decision 2 days ago. He wasn't resigning his commission. Jack Callahan was a SEAL down to his marrow, but he had requested and received a transfer to Naval Station Great Lakes. He would serve as a senior instructor for advanced small unit tactics. It was a desk job by his standards, a step back from the tip of the spear. But as he turned to look at the porch, he knew it was the most important assignment of his life. On the wraparound porch, The scene was a tableau of everything he had fought to protect. Eleanor Callahan sat in her favorite rocking chair, the rhythmic creak thump of the wood against the floorboards acting as the heartbeat of the afternoon. The color had returned to her cheeks, a soft, healthy pink that matched the yarn she was expertly weaving into a winter scarf. Her eyes, no longer wide with fear, crinkled at the corners as she laughed at a joke, her hands moving with the steady, practiced grace of a woman who had reclaimed her peace. Seated next to her was Judge Evelyn Reed, the iron gavel, having traded her severe charcoal suit for a floral Sunday dress that softened her edges, though her eyes remained as sharp as flint. She was balancing a saucer of fine china on her knee, looking pleased with herself. Evelyn had brought news earlier that morning. Richard Davenport had been denied bail and was negotiating a plea deal that would see him behind bars for a decade. The corrupt police chief had resigned in disgrace, and the Riverbend Plaza project had been officially scrapped. The land was designated as a protected heritage site in perpetuity. The war was over, and the good guys had won. They were joined by two new faces, neighbors who had been too afraid to visit during the dark times, but had now rallied around Eleanor. There was Mrs. Diane Peterson, the widow who lived 3 houses down. She was a round, cheerful woman with an apron she seemingly never took off. She had arrived with a welcome home apple spice cake that smelled of cinnamon, nutmeg, and comfort. Sitting opposite her was Mr. Sam Miller, a retired railway conductor in his 80s, with a snowy white mustache and a cane he used more for gesturing than walking. He was a man of few words, but deep loyalty, having mowed Eleanor's lawn in secret while Jack was away, a small act of defiance against the mayor's intimidation. "I told you, Eleanor," Mr. Miller rumbled, his voice like gravel in a bucket. "That boy of yours wasn't going to let them take a single shingle off this roof. He's got the colonel's fire in him." Eleanor smiled, her gaze drifting from her knitting to her son standing on the lawn. "He has his father's fire, Sam," she agreed softly. "But he has his own heart, a good heart." Jack caught her eye and smiled back, a genuine, unguarded expression that took years off his face. He wound up his arm and threw the tennis ball. "Kodiak, fetch." The German shepherd, who had been lying in a patch of sun near the porch steps, exploded into motion. Kodiak was no longer the silent phantom of the rainy garden or the weapon that had crushed an assassin's arm. Today he was just a dog. He galloped across the green grass, his tongue lolling out in a goofy grin, his ears flopping in the wind. He caught the ball on the first bounce, skidding to a halt near the rose bushes before trotting back to Jack with a proud prance, his tail wagging so hard his entire back half shook with the force of it. Jack ruffled the thick fur around the dog's neck, taking the slobbery ball. "Good boy," Jack whispered. "At ease, soldier. You're off duty." Jack walked up the steps, wiping his hands on his jeans, and accepted a glass of iced tea from Mrs. Peterson. The glass was cold, sweating with condensation, the tea dark and sweet with a wedge of lemon perched on the rim. The taste of the Midwest, the taste of home. He leaned against the porch railing, looking at the group. They were elderly, some frail, all marked by the passage of time. Yet they possessed a resilience that humbled him. They were the history keepers, the storytellers, the foundation upon which his own life was built. For years, Jack had defined his worth by missions accomplished, targets neutralized, and medals pinned to his chest in solemn ceremonies. He had traveled to the ends of the earth to fight for the abstract concept of freedom and security. But as he looked at his mother safe in her chair, laughing as Judge Reed recounted the look on Davenport's face when the recording played, Jack realized a profound truth. The battlefield was vast, and the enemies of the nation were many, but the ultimate victory wasn't found in a treaty signed in a foreign capital or a flag raised over a conquered hill. It was found here. It was found in the sound of a rocking chair on a Sunday afternoon. It was found in the safety of a mother who could close her eyes at night without fear. It was found in the ability of a community to gather, drink tea, and share cake without the shadow of tyranny darkening their door. Jack took a sip of tea, the sweetness washing away the lingering bitterness of the past week. He wasn't leaving the Navy, but his mission had evolved. He would train the next generation of warriors, yes, but he would do it knowing exactly what they were fighting for. He looked at Kodiak, who had collapsed happily at Eleanor's feet, resting his head on her slipper. The dog let out a contented sigh, closing his eyes. Jack felt the tension leave his own shoulders, replaced by a deep, abiding gratitude. A soldier fights for the country, for the flag, and for the brother beside him. But Jack finally understood that the soldier's greatest glory is not in the battles he wins, but in the peace he secures for the ones he loves.